Hello, everyone. I'm Bob Goulder with Tax Notes. Welcome to the latest edition of In the Pages, where we take a closer look at some of the content from our print and online publications. This month's featured article examines the OECD inclusive framework, which of course has given the world the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 reform proposals that we keep on hearing so much about. This project, what can I say? It's a once in a generation effort, an attempt at transformative change. And so far to date, it looks like it's on track to succeed, although still a lot of work to be done. The actual article is titled A New World Tax Order, the Inclusive Framework and Its Future. And its two authors are with us today. We have Ama Sarfo, contributing editor with Tax Notes, and Stephanie Soong Johnston, chief correspondent, also with Tax Notes. Ladies, welcome to In the Pages.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Bob, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, really enjoyed reading this article, and I got the sense in sifting through it that you probably enjoyed writing it as much as I enjoyed reading it. Just out of curiosity, how much time did you spend on this? This isn't something that you just threw together in a weekend. This is a big effort, right?
No, we started this project in May, I want to say. I think it was May. So from May through November, we did a lot of research. We spoke to many, many different people, just trying to get a grasp on exactly what the inclusive framework is and what stakeholders really enjoyed about the process and what they thought needed some work.
Excellent. Well, let's dig in because there's a lot of ground to cover. Now, you begin your article by referencing a date on the calendar, this past October 8th, which of course is when we had the final high-level political agreement for Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, a date that will go down in history, at least tax history, let's say that. So, Stephanie, first question, do you think that in the grand scheme of things, in historical terms, are we underestimating or overestimating the importance of the inclusive framework?
I think there is a tendency to kind of get overly excited about things like this, but I think in this case, it seems that, just because I've been covering this subject for like the OECD for about 10 years now, it seems that this group is significant and is historic in a lot of ways, because it is really the first time that so many countries have gotten together and actually managed to agree on something so controversial as taxing rights and minimum taxation. I mean, these two concepts have been key concepts that non-governmental organizations have been calling for years, decades even. And the fact that nearly 140 countries have gotten together, overcome their differences to reach some sort of agreement, even if it's just political in nature, on these two topics it's a remarkable achievement. The only other time I can think of that countries have gotten together in this kind of format is the Global Forum on tax transparency and exchange of information for tax purposes, because in that forum there are about 160 something countries belonging to that forum, and even though it's not like a standard setting body, like the standards that they implement are not exactly, I don't think that they are agreed on by the whole group, but the fact that they can all come together in that forum and agree on that, but in exchange for tax purposes, like in exchange of information for tax purposes, I think that's also significant. But the inclusive framework is really the first time that they have gotten together for corporate tax purposes. So it's an achievement. I think it's significant, and that's why we decided to write about it. And actually, I got to give a shout out to Ama about this, because she was the one who thought this is a great time to start talking about the inclusive framework, because this is the 5th year of its existence. So after 5 years, you start kind of reevaluating your life in a lot of ways. So we thought maybe it would be a good exercise to apply it to the inclusive framework.
Well, Ama, let's talk about the formation of the inclusive framework. You say how it started in 2016, but the final BEPS reports came out in, what was it, October 2015? Less than a year earlier. And the question I want to ask you is, how do we get from the first iteration of BEPS, right? Those 15 action items. How do we get from that to the inclusive framework? Because what I'm getting at here is, didn't somebody say, hey, BEPS was enough, let's call it a day and go home? That didn't happen. There was some kind of momentum that said, no, we need this other thing. What happened?
You're right, that didn't happen. And the question you pose is a really great one. So just to provide a little bit of background on the BEPS project, it was a joint initiative between the OECD and the G20. And the BEPS reports that you mentioned were really just one part of the package, because after the OECD published these reports, the next phase was implementation. And that implementation phase has a very long tail. I mean, it's still ongoing today because the OECD and G20 decided that out of those 15 different action plans, that 4 in particular were going to become minimum standards. And the OECD felt that in order to adequately address BEPS, that as many countries in the world as possible needed to sign on to the project and agree to implement these 4 minimum standards. But the problem was that most of the world was not involved in the BEPS process. I mean, you had G20 members who were non-OECD countries who had to pay a fee and receive a special status to participate in the BEPS negotiations, as we highlighted in our article, and then also some developing countries and observer organizations like the African Tax Administration Forum were allowed to observe the negotiations and provide some inputs, but ultimately what really ruled was the opinion of the OECD and G20 countries. So in that light, the OECD just couldn't say, well, we want the entire world to impose these BEPS standards without giving them some sort of buy-in. So the one place where it could give other countries a say was on implementation. And so that's how the inclusive framework came to be.
Yeah, until I read your article, I didn't realize that these payments were taking place. And it sounds a little bit like pay to play, which has a negative connotation. It's like, yes, we will give you, a non-OECD member state, a seat at the table, but you have to write us a check. Was that controversial at all?
I don't think it came up really during our conversations with people.
Yeah.
But I think it's just,
yeah, I suppose it addresses a free rider problem, right? Because the countries who are OECD members have to contribute to the budget. And then if the OECD is doing a project and there's all these countries that aren't members that are having a seat at the table, arguably you could say that's a free rider problem, because you have to charge them something. Otherwise, you kind of feel like a fool joining the OECD if you could have been outside and still had the same say, right? So I don't know. We won't focus on the payment, but it's just interesting to note that they did have to write a check to be heard. Now we're sort of ending the year on a high point. Right? In October, we had this political agreement, and I'm imagining that bottles of champagne are being opened, saying we did it on this expedited time frame. We finally did it, but it was a rough road for each of you. What do you think the low points were?
So I think the low point, I was thinking your question because I was thinking about what Pascal Saint-Amand said during a recent conference. He said that the safe harbor proposal that Treasury put forth before the Biden administration took over was sort of the poison pill of the negotiations, which sort of ground everything to a halt. Because, why would a country agree to a solution to tax digital companies when the multinationals that are going to be in scope can opt out of the rules? So that, I think, was a low point, because that threatened to derail the negotiations politically, because countries didn't want to let multinationals opt into tax rules. So that was a big obstacle, I think, from where I stood. Luckily, I think the Biden administration, when they came in, they're credited with unlocking those negotiations. That's that obstacle by proposing this comprehensive scoping idea. That that got rid of the need to distinguish between automated digital services companies and consumer-facing business companies. That was the original idea for Pillar 1, to have the Pillar 1 rules applied just to those companies. But the idea is like, well, the question is then, how do you distinguish which companies are in scope and which aren't? Of course, that leads to a lot of lobbying and a lot of hair tearing out and tantrums and stuff. But I think that's comprehensive scoping idea that Treasury put forth really was instrumental in unlocking the progress negotiations.
And I was going to say, this may be an unpopular opinion, but I actually thought that the July 1st statement, in which the OECD indicated that a majority of the Inclusive Framework members had reached a preliminary political agreement on the 2-pillar package, was a bit of a low point, because there we saw that there were some holdouts, specifically some pretty big economies. I mean, Kenya and Nigeria declined to sign on to that agreement. And then later we saw that they declined to sign on to the final deal, period. So when Kenya and Nigeria decided to abstain from that agreement, it definitely raised some questions as to whether other countries might decide to splinter off, between then and October, when the OECD reached the final deal. So that's when we really saw that, yes, there was some disagreement, and coming from some pretty big economies.
In the article, you refer to the inclusive framework as a sort of a grand experiment in multilateralism. And it got me thinking that, the general mood the last couple of years has sort of been moving away from that. And I don't know if it's the after effects of Brexit, or an inclination for people to go back to tariffs and not be so scared of trade wars, or just a more isolationist tendencies. Is it ironic at all that this grand experiment in multilateralism sort of clashes with these other impulses that go in the other direction? Stephanie, what did you think?
This actually all goes back to the concept that the OECD has pushed. It's called the tax paradox, where multilateralism is essential for countries to retain their own tax sovereignty. So they must cooperate with other countries in order to protect your own interests, which is an odd thing to think about. It is a paradox, but in a lot of ways, I think it is true. That's what's that's the driving force of the inclusive framework. I wonder too whether the pandemic has actually pushed the multilateralism aspect toward a more positive outcome, because it just goes to show how interconnected we all are, and the interest it isn't in the common interest of all countries to work together on rules that they hope would improve the world economy.
Just piggybacking off of what Stephanie said, I think that the whole inclusive framework process in negotiating pillars 1 and pillar 2 really showed how people can arrive at the same conclusion through different avenues. I mean, you had the US deciding to engage in the latter stages because it wanted to limit unilateral digital services taxes on its digital giants. And then meanwhile, the initial distinction that the OECD wanted to make between digital companies and non-digital companies didn't really seem to work, because many multinationals have both sorts of business models, and it would have been really confusing to figure out in which ways pillar 1 with the new taxing right would apply to a multinational. So here we saw the US Treasury decide to engage with the process and say, hey, you know what, let's simplify this process and apply this to the top 100 companies globally. And then on the other hand, we had growing numbers of countries in the European Union and elsewhere deciding to apply their own unilateral digital services taxes, and then running afoul of the US, which decided that it was going to impose sanctions on countries with DSTs, although it suspended them. So for those countries, it made sense to engage multilaterally so that they could reach some sort of agreement with the United States. And then on the other hand, you also had developing countries who really wanted to show that they are involved in the world economy, that they are participants, and engaging with the inclusive framework gave them the opportunity to do that. And then on the other hand, they're also learning about BEPS issues, or trying to figure out how they can solve BEPS issues in their own countries. And again, engaging with the inclusive framework gave them an opportunity to do that.
So here's a question. Why do all that through the OECD? I mean, when you stop and think about it, you look at the composition of the inclusive framework, it more or less parallels what you have in other bodies, whether that's the World Bank or the IMF or the United Nations. Obviously, those groups have membership that's even broader than the inclusive framework. But, it's almost as if the world had institutions available to them to take on this project, and it specifically chose not to do them. Does that still stand out as controversial in any way?
Well, I think it's important to look at the makeup and mandate of other institutions. So, for example, there have been very insistent calls for global tax policy making to be relocated to the United Nations. And this is because the UN is open to all countries, whereas the OECD, has, I think, now 38 member countries. So the UN does have its own tax body, the UN Tax Committee, but the UN Tax Committee doesn't reflect the wider UN membership. I mean, I think there are only 25 experts who sit on that committee, and they serve in their own capacity to specifically address the tax concerns of developing countries. And then you have the World Bank or the IMF, who do deal with international tax, and quite intimately so, but in different contexts. So the IMF does so because it's lending to countries, so it has an interest in monitoring, their economic and fiscal policies. The World Bank is devoted to assisting low income and middle income countries. So there, I mean, just given the very specific work that they do, it really wouldn't make sense, I think, to relocate international tax policy making to those bodies. I mean, the one place where I guess it would make sense would be the UN, but that idea has not gotten off the ground. There are a lot of political conflicts at play there.
And we also explore in the piece, like even if it were, if the tax standard setting responsibilities were sent to the UN, I mean, countries would still run into the same political problems that they run into in the inclusive framework. So, changing the venue may not actually dispel any of these challenges.
Okay, so we've got the inclusive framework, and you have nations. When people talk about the so-called BRIC nations, right? Countries just say, includes Brazil, India, big marketplaces, but they're on the outside when it comes to the OECD, but they're on the inside when it comes to the inclusive framework. Were they really on equal footing? Were their voices heard? I guess the question I'm asking is, how inclusive really was the inclusive framework?
So the BRICS countries, I mean, they are all part of the G20, South Africa, India, China. So I think all those countries, and Argentina, I mean, they're all parts of the G20, and the G20 was driving the whole BEST project and this latest project, the two-pillar project. So, I mean, they did have a really strong say in, well, on paper anyway, in what, what direction the project went and where, the creation of the rules. But, there was still that tension, I thought. We found that there's still that tension within even the G20. I mean, Carlos Prado Argentina, I mean, he's Argentina's key delegate at the inclusive framework. And I mean, he has told us that, the deal is, not ideal. he said it publicly, this is not like the best deal ever. I mean, it's actually a bad deal, but a bad deal is better than no deal. So, I mean, there is that, that maybe there's that aspect of inclusive framework membership. So, I mean, yeah, so I mean, the BRICS countries were actively involved at the G20 level, but I don't know if that really played out entirely in the inclusive framework proceedings.
What about the African countries? I believe it was South Africa was dubbed an associate member of the BEPS the first time around. Do they have the same sense that this is sort of a compromise, that it's not what they would have come up with, but some solution is better than no solution? How well were the African nations served by all of this?
That's a really great question, and I think that you're feeling that the African countries felt like they got some concessions, but maybe not as many as they would have liked. I think that that is definitely correct. I mean, we saw, as you mentioned, South Africa was really heavily involved. Senegal was heavily involved. Nigeria was heavily involved. So they did take ownership in the process. Some African countries, or rather representatives from some African countries, were reflected on the Inclusive Frameworks Steering Group. So definitely, I mean, that shows that they saw that they had an opportunity to shape the outcome of the process. And then also on top of that, some people told us that they felt as though African countries kind of were represented twice, because they were represented through their own home governments, but then they were also represented through ATAF. And ATAF was cited by several people as being this really aspirational model, I would say, within these international tax negotiations, because ATAF serves multiple roles. So on one hand, it attends these inclusive framework meetings or international deliberations to brief its members on what's happening, so that they can have a better idea of what the discussions mean and what they mean for their home countries. But then on the other hand, and this is the more unique thing about ATAF, is that they also formulate one organization-wide policy approach. So they enter these negotiations as a block and say, this is what we, the members of ATAF, would like. And so that is really important from a regional perspective, but then also just from a broader policymaking perspective, because I think it gives smaller countries, especially, some of the smaller members of ATAF, an opportunity to feel like their inputs have a bit of a heavier weight.
Okay, now what about Ghana? My understanding is that it had sort of a peculiar status here, where it was in the Global Forum on Transparency, but not in the inclusive framework. What was going on there? Ama?
So Ghana is a bit of an interesting story, as you had mentioned. So most countries that belong to the Global Forum also belong to the Inclusive Framework, but Ghana only belongs to the Global Forum. And Ghana joined the Global Forum because I think in the early 2000s, the country was thinking about starting an international financial services center. And so, when that became publicized, I think they were approached to see if they were interested in kind of ensuring that their international standards were in line with, the Global Forum's general transparency standards. So that's how Ghana joined the Global Forum and worked on implementing the exchange of information standards and whatnot. And then concurrently with that, Ghana was also participating in the OECD's capacity building programs. I mean, the Global Forum has a lot. Also, the UN Tax Committee does a lot. And so through that, Ghana had a really strong picture or a strong idea of what it would need to do to really bring its general international tax standards in line with the global standards. So when the OECD inclusive framework came into the picture, Ghana realized that it just didn't have the time, it didn't have the capacity to follow the requirements of both programs. So that's what led Ghana to decide that it would just focus on the Global Forum and not focus on the inclusive framework so much. So I think it's a really interesting story in that, the capacity training provided by the OECD, that knowledge provided by the OECD essentially empowered Ghana to say, hey, you know what, thanks, but we think we're gonna sit this one out. And I think that's a fair decision to make.
An interesting point, though, about Ghana is that they actually never really said no to joining the inclusive framework. So I think the door is still open. It sounded like the door might be still open to maybe possibly joining in the future. So we'll see.
Were there any nations that dropped out? So in other words, they were invited in or they joined, and then they saw the progress being made, and they saw the general direction it was going in, and they thought, you know what, we want to change our mind. We want out of here. Were there any quitters?
So yes, Bangladesh and Eritrea were initially part of the inclusive framework, but left for reasons unknown. We have not been able to contact them. So yeah, it's, I don't think there are other ones we could identify.
Yeah.
All right. Now, just in terms of the day-to-day business of getting the project moving ahead, you write about growing pains, operational growing pains, sort of separate from the tax policy per se. Things like, what language do they do? Do they do it in Spanish? Do they do it in English? Do they do it in French, which in the old days used to be the international lingua franca of diplomacy, right? Tell us about the growing pains.
Yeah, so I mean, language was a big issue. You know, that's the OECD operates on with English and French, but most countries, you know, they speak other languages. I mean, French, English, Spanish. So there was a lot of there were problems with, you know, translating documents and like conducting interviews in their native languages. So there was like that lag between, you know, meetings and the outcomes, and then like translation of documents. So that was an issue that delegates identified. You know, also like I think the pandemic has also given it was also a challenge because, you know, a lot of negotiations, multilateral negotiations happen, you know, in person, you know, and most of the progress really happens during coffee breaks or in the hallways or, you know, outside of the plenary rooms, the meeting rooms. So I think that the pandemic had a big effect on negotiations. Also, you know, even before the pandemic, I mean, it cost a lot of money for a lot of delegates to get to attend meetings in Paris. So I mean, there was the constraints there, the resource constraints there were an issue for delegates we talked to.
And just to add to what Stephanie said, getting political buy-in from leaders was also a challenge for inclusive framework delegates. I mean, you know, you have these tax experts, they're in Paris or they're meeting virtually and they understand what the challenges are, but then they have to go back to their home governments and explain the case for why their countries need to sign up to pillars 1 and 2. And in some cases, you know, developing countries were able to make that case, and others where their political leaders weren't as involved, they weren't able to make that case. And so that was another area that people flagged for us as important. And as far as, you know, overcoming these challenges, I mean, I think with this political buy-in challenge or all the challenges that Stephanie mentioned, the inclusive framework hasn't overcome them yet, but it's looking at ways in which it can address them. And so we see that in the developing countries report that the inclusive framework in G20 released in early October. So on that, I guess the thing to say is just stay tuned, really.
Yeah, stay tuned for a lot of reasons. One of the things that I'm looking forward to sort of figuring out is whether the OECD can ever again engage in what I refer to as a solo act, right? Because in the past, you've had the OECD come up with its model tax convention or its transfer pricing guidelines and so forth. And I'm just wondering if it'll ever really be able to do something like that again, acting in its own name. And you sort of touch on that. There was an exchange in the article with a UK tax official. I think it was Mike Williams from HMRC, who's very close to this project. And he asked somewhat rhetorically, is it enough that we develop these new rules and they only apply for OECD member states? And he answers his own question by saying, well, you know, years ago, decades ago, maybe that would have flown. But not now, not now in 2021. It doesn't make any sense in the area of globalization to have OECD countries making these big new tax rules just for themselves. So what does that say about the future? Are we ever going to see another project where the OECD says, oh, here's some new initiative we're talking about, whether it's environmental taxes or natural resource taxes? Are they now doomed for all of eternity? And maybe doomed is the wrong word, but are they going to have to bring in a broader set of stakeholders if they ever want to do anything again?
I absolutely agree that yes, the OECD from here on out cannot just operate within its own little bubble. I thought that the quote that Mike gave us was just really profound, and I think really illuminates the path for the OECD moving forward. And we see that, you know, with the OECD's planned implementation for pillars 1 and 2, I mean, the fact that it is focusing so heavily on developing countries and so heavily on their implementation just goes to show how important the OECD thinks that that block of countries is to really implementing any sort of global tax deal moving forward. So yes, I think that in terms of, you know, implementing environmental measures or whatever other ideas the OECD has on the table, I think it's really set a precedent moving forward that yes, if it's going to engage in anything on a large scale, that it realizes that it cannot just rely on the OECD membership.
Right, and developing countries also now have a taste for multilateral cooperation on corporate tax matters. So it'd be really hard to, you know, give them this opportunity and then take it back. You know, I think that's never going to happen. And, you know, the fact that the Inclusive Frameworks mandate has been renewed to last of 2024, I think that's probably, I mean, I would guess it would be extended even further once 2024 rolls around. I mean, once all the countries embark on this two-pillar solution to corporate tax reform, I mean, you're going to have all countries involved, and maybe even more countries that aren't involved in the Inclusive Framework now. So we spoke recently with an OECD official, you know, who said, "Oh, you know, we're still working with the 4 holdouts. You know, they're still involved. We're working with them. They're engaged. We are also talking to other countries that didn't join the Inclusive Framework at the outset to see if they're interested in joining again during the second phase of the project. So, I mean, stay tuned for that as well. Genie's out of the bottle. Can't stuff it back in."
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The genie is definitely out of the bottle here. So you mentioned the Inclusive Frameworks mandate was extended when to 2024, but should it ever go away now? I mean, what do they do for an encore? Once you've done this, once you've done pillar 1 and pillar 2, what's next? It almost seems like it would be a huge waste of political capital and resources once you've built this institution to say, okay, we did pillar 1, pillar 2, we're gonna quit now and go back to the old ways. You know, should it take on other things next? I mean, could this evolve into sort of a global tax organization? I don't want to call it the World Tax Organization because we already have a WTO in the trade area, but this has momentum now. And once you've built something with momentum, there's an impulse to keep it going. What are your thoughts?
There's absolutely an impulse to keep it moving. I mean, I think just with BEPS 1.0 and BEPS 2.0, the Inclusive Framework is going to have its hands full just in terms of implementing and also monitoring. And I think that's especially true with BEPS 2.0, just because pillars 1 and 2 are such a striking change to the international tax order that I think it'll take a lot of time and effort and a lot of care to make sure that those new rules are working as they should. So just based on that alone, I don't think that the Inclusive Framework is going to go anywhere anytime soon. But as you had mentioned, yes, there is this momentum. The Inclusive Framework has shown that, yes, we can collectively decide on new rules. So from here on out, if the Inclusive Framework decides that it wants to tackle other projects, there definitely is that momentum. There's that decision-making infrastructure in place, which was very difficult to implement in the first place. So I think just based off of that, we have this first mover advantage within the Inclusive Framework to really be a global standard setter moving forward.
I might add one more thing to build on what Emma said, that the OECD produced a report for the G20 about developing countries and the benefits they're getting from the Inclusive Framework, just assessing how well it's working for them. And in that report, it suggested, you know, there could be other topics that the Inclusive Framework could tackle in the future. You know, one of them was carbon pricing. which is a very controversial topic in itself. There has been talk, especially from the OECD Secretary General, Matthias Cormann, to adapt the inclusive framework structure to tackle carbon pricing. And Pascal Saint-Amand actually mentioned recently that this inclusive framework for carbon pricing will be separate from this inclusive framework we're talking about now. So we'll see what happens with that in the near future.
So we could end up with two inclusive frameworks, one for corporate income taxes and one for carbon pricing. How many inclusive frameworks are optimal? I guess we'll find out. But there could be no limit. But it's very exciting times. Again, once in a generation type of tax reform proposals going on here. And the coverage has been really unique. So we thank you for that. The article, again, is called A New World Tax Order, the Inclusive Framework and Its Future. You can find it on our website. So thank you for watching, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you for having us.
Want more like this? Subscribe for more tax videos. Special thanks to our executive producers, Jasper Smith and Paige Jones, and showrunner and video editor, Jordan Parrish.